Hello! I'm Elaine, and I'm a tour guide in the French Quarter. I do ghost tours. And I am not going to tell you the stories that I tell on my tour, because you gotta pay for those. But if you want to hear some interesting things that have happened to me while I'm leading random drunk people around the French Quarter, I got you. So, do you ever have one of those days at work that just like everything that could go wrong goes wrong? Tonight was one of those nights. First, I was running a little bit late, like I was going to arrive just in time to get out of my car and make it to starting location the 15 minutes before the tour starts that we're officially supposed to do so. And I get stuck behind a truck who has decided to just park in the middle of the road to unload. And like, usually this is New Orleans. The response to that is you just back up down the street until you get to a corner and go around the corner. And there was a film crew on the corner, but also nobody behind me was backing up. So I was just stuck, sitting there, watching it get closer and closer to 8:30, going, oh God, I'm gonna be late. And I messaged the office and like, but eventually they let me go. I managed to make it past. I find a parking spot surprisingly easily. And then I get out and run over, and when I get to the starting location, my guests aren't there. And I'm like, what? Because I'm supposed to have like 27 guests. So I'm looking around, and I notice about 3 to 4 doors down, there is a group of loud drunk people hanging around, and they're doing the normal loud drunk thing, everybody talking at once, people falling over, and I'm like, that's probably my group. I'm just going to go out and limb here and assume that it's them. So I sort of take one step towards them and call out, hey guys, are y'all here for a tour? And as always seems to happen, two different people made eye contact with me, shook their head, and turned away. And I was like, okay, I guess they're not. And then I stood there waiting. And at this point, it's almost time for me to get started. And I'm still missing everyone. And I'm like, those are definitely my guests. So once again, I walk down there. And this time I'm like maybe 5 feet away from them before I'm like, guys, are y'all here for a tour? And again, someone shakes their head. But one of the other girls looks up at me and goes, oh yeah, are you waiting for the bad bitches too? And I'm like, I am the tour guide. And she's like, oh! And eventually I get them all signed in. I have to send a couple of them off to the bathroom, and that in itself was a bit of a adventure, because some of them were already so drunk that explaining things to them like there is no bar or bathroom break, so you need to go pee now, was like explaining to cats. But about 10 minutes late, we're getting started, and I'm having to call out multiple times, like, guys, gather round, gather round, gather round, focus on me, listen to me, let's be quiet so we can hear me talk. And finally, one of the drunkest girls stands up next to me and screams, 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. And I'm like, oh, I have drunk preschool teachers. That's who my tour is. Now, it was only a small group of them were preschool teachers, but yes, they were the drunkest of the entire crew. And throughout the course of the evening, the normal things happened. They talked over me. They talked, like, while I was talking. One girl kept shaking her head at me as if I was telling something wrong, and I'd be like, yeah? And she'd be like, what? I'm like, okay, whatever. But my favorite was this one girl who asked, they weren't bad questions, like objectively, just in the scheme of the universe, these were not bad questions. But questions to ask a tour guide on a tour, some of them were a bit difficult. At one point, she asked me to explain the entire Catholic calendar between Christmas straight up through Easter, and every time I'd explain anything about it, her response would be like, but why? But why? Why? And I'm like, this is way too in-depth of a concept to cover on a tour. But finally, we're heading towards the location where there is filming tonight. So we can't get to the actual house. And this is the big house, the one that everyone stops at. And so like there are a string of like 15 tour guides shoved into like one little street trying to figure out where we can do stops. So I'm trying to be as quiet as possible while these drunk girls are talking over me and like randomly shouting things that are mostly really inappropriate. And this one girl, about halfway through the stop, starts like asking repeatedly, yeah, but how do I go in? How can I go in? When can I go in? And finally, I'm like, I'll answer questions at the end. And when I finish, I'm like, any questions? And she doesn't say anything, but I'm like, fuck it, I'm answering her question anyway. And I'm like, okay, so on going into this property, you can't. It's a privately owned home. And she's like, well, what if I know the guy? And I'm like, do you? And she's like, well, who is he? And I'm like, he's a very private individual. He doesn't generally have his name out there. And she's like, well, how do I reach out to him so I can ask him if I can go in? And I'm like, you can't. And she's like, well, why not? I could probably find him on Facebook. And I'm like, he's a multimillionaire. You cannot just reach out and ask him if you can go tour his house. But finally, I decide to take my group a bit closer to the house proper so that they can see, even though there's filming happening right there. And I take us over, and meanwhile, I'm communicating with another tour guide to find out, is my path ahead completely blocked? And he's like, yes. And I'm like, cool, get to backtrack. So I show them the house, then we backtrack, and I'm walking past some of the trailers set up for the filming. And there, right against one of the trailer's wheel, is this drunk girl from my group, who it seems has wandered away and decided to pee against the trailer. Now, that's not that unusual. People peeing in places they shouldn't is part of New Orleans, even though I wish it wasn't. But what bothered me about this was the fact that she chose to do it under the watchful eye of 4 different tours and 2 closed-circuit cameras pointed directly at her. And I'm just like, oh, God. Now, luckily, they left after that, but it wasn't the end of our interactions with them, because a couple blocks away, we're walking past, and I see this girl is passed out on the road, and I'm like, okay, guys, we're going to go to the other side of the street, because the rest of my guests were also drunk, and I didn't want them tripping over the girl who had passed out on the sidewalk. And I noticed that she has friends with her, so I'm not too worried about whoever this person passed out is. And admittedly, they're taking selfies in the middle of the road with a car honking at them, but, at least they're upright, and we're across the street and just beginning to pass them when I look over and realize that the girls who are passed out in the road are my guests who had left 2 stories before. And I very pointedly look away and pretend I did not see them. And when one of my guests was like, isn't that our? I'm like, nope, not my responsibility. They left the tour. They're not mine anymore. They're done.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and feel free to share your own experiences in the comments below.